Well, good morning once again. I'm going to begin right now the panel. I'm started the recording. So we have a panel, a trilingual panel, as I explained a few minutes before in the previous chat, with two papers in English, one paper in Portuguese, and the last one in Spanish. And the title of this panel, of this trilingual panel, is Places of Memory, Lugares de Memória. We have people in America, in Europe, and from different countries in Europe, from Portugal, from Ireland, from North Ireland, and also from Italy. So the first participant will be Melina Scheuermann. She's a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Political and Social Science at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Italy. And her paper is entitled Animated Memories, Potential and Strategies of Animated Documentary Dealing with Collective Memory. Melina, you can begin your presentation when you want. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm sharing my screen. Good morning, everyone. Today I represent the research that I've conducted for my master thesis in cinema studies at Stockholm University with the title Animated Memories. Animated documentaries allow us to create images for incidents of which no visual footage exists. As such, animated documentary allows for new perspectives and stories to be told that may become part of collective memory. Beyond the ability of representing narratives otherwise inaccessible, I argue that animated documentary also allows for novel forms of memories that enable and emphasize embodied and haptic experiences, while at the same time produce strategies of creating trustworthy relationships between the viewer and the film inaccessible for non-animated documentary film. The case study I worked on is the interactive animated documentary Sadnaya, Inside the Syrian Torture Prison that was directed by E.L. Weitzman from the research agency Forensic Architecture in cooperation with Amnesty International and is accessible as a website. Based on the memory of 5 former detainees, the team created an interactive 3D model of the torture prison called Sadnaya, of which except satellite images, no visual footage exists. The prison is one of the torture prisons run by the Syrian government, and since 2011, several thousand people have been held in custody here and have been tortured. The project is heavily shaped by the academic and artistic work called Forensic Aesthetics, developed by Forensic Architecture, which is a novel department at Goldsmith University in London. Testimony is based on memory. The forensic aesthetics applied here translate this memory/testimony of not only the happenings in the prison, but the architectural site, including its acoustics and auditory experience, into an animated model. Forensic aesthetics ascribe physical matter the function of documenting, in this case documenting the torture of the detainees. Forensic aesthetics thus shift away from the illustrative use of animation and employs aesthetic techniques as investigation resources and means or tools. I've applied a feminist spatial approach as developed by the film scholar Juliana Bruno, who aims to move from an ontology of cinema located with spectacle, oculocentrism, and the gaze towards one based in spatiality and motion. Much of her spatial understanding is based upon the close relationship between architecture and cinema. Applying this approach to an interactive animated documentary gives us novel insights into the characteristics, forms, and strategies of animated documentary images. The relationship between memory and architecture goes back to the relationship between memory and architecture goes back to Roman times and Cicero's work on how orators remembered their long speeches through the tool of so-called memory palaces. We can imagine the memory of a trained orator as architecturally constructed. They would mentally walk around a building, set up every room with images, then would retraverse the building, move around the space again, revisiting all the rooms that have been fitted out with images. In other words, when we recollect memories, we mentally travel through spaces that we have once inhabited. Those mental walks of memory affect the body of the spectator and can initiate somatic responses and emotions. In Sadnaya, the process of the modeling of the 3D prison invokes visual, auditory, and sensory memories of the former detainees who begin to recall details of their traumatic experiences otherwise inaccessible to them. Returning to the place of torture in order to be able to give situated testimony was impossible in this case. Animation has given the possibility to express such testimony through the creation, or rather reconstruction, of the virtual space. One of Bruno's main and underlying arguments is seeing is going. Here she draws back to the concept of montage by Sergei Eisenstein. Pivotal for this connection of seeing and going is the idea of a moving spectator for both cinema and architecture. Eisenstein describes how the eyes and mind of the spectator follow an imaginary path across multiple spatially and temporally disparate phenomena that are arranged in a temporal sequence, the montage. Even though the filmic spectator is seemingly static, she too traverses multiple times and sides, connects those and organizes them as shots from different viewpoints. Thus, in both film and architecture, montage are shaped by the movements of a spectator. We have to acknowledge, though, that there's a difference between being physically moved by walking through an architectural site and being mentally moved by the montage of a film. This is relevant, especially since in Sadnaya, we experience montage only in the film clips that we encounter, while for the rest, the viewer is navigating by pointing and dragging through the 3D prison model, involving her hand to move her vision. How do montage and navigation relate to each other then? Movement is inevitably linked to temporality and spatiality. In montage and navigation, time and space are mobilized in different ways, though. In montage, it's done by the temporal linear sequencing of different images, shots, and frames. If we think about an analog film strip, the linearity of the sequences is apparent. Strung in a row, frame follows frame, side follows side. When watching, we are moved from image to image. In navigation, time is sequenced by the directed movement across space, in the rhythm of walking, for example. Rather than following a linear time-progressive track, time is spatialized in navigation. We watch through moving from image to image. Bruno's theorization of seeing as going, architecture and cinema, both as spatial matters through which bodies move and are moved, becomes ever so clear in Sadnaya. This stresses the embodied and haptic experiences of animated and virtual space. Thinking about bodily sensations and steering vision through our hands leads us to Gilles Deleuze's concept of haptics. The navigation via a touchpad or a mouse through Sadnaya corresponds to tactile vision, as the eye is subordinated to the hand. Haptics, according to Deleuze, describe the abolition of subordination between eye and hand. Both are engaged equally, and thereby the eye has become an organ of touch. Haptic visuality does not only rely on optical vision, but draws also on the sense of touch and kinesthetics. Frontality, the suppression of depth, as it can be found also in the Egyptian bas-relief and Francis Bacon artworks, according to Deleuze, invite a haptic look that rests on surfaces and touches upon the materiality of images instead of entering into deep space. We can access the haptic potential of Sadnaya if we consider the materiality of the animated images. As spectators of Sadnaya, we gain insights into the participatory modeling process and watch the virtual model being created. This makes us aware of its constructed character, even more so than the media-specific characteristic of animation already achieves. This heightened awareness of the constructiveness of the images extends, or rather stands in a mutually affecting relationship with the haptic materiality of these virtual images. For example, the opacity of the slowly rotating 3D model we see on the start page of the website can be controlled by a sliding regulator in the upper right corner. Whether such reflection was intended or not, what is mobilized here is the awareness of the controllability of the animated model, as well as material malleability. Both the focus on the surfaces and the awareness of the different qualities of the images invite a haptic look. This haptic look is also invited by certain sequences in the video clips. In the clip Fear Starts in the Afternoon, project participant Anas places 13 detainees in a 360-degree rotatable and isolated animated construction of a group cell. The rotatability resembles the possibilities to turn the room around like an object or matter in one's hand. Han and I are equally engaged in the perception of the images whose virtual materiality is emphasized. The animated bodies of the detainees too become virtual matter. The detainees are represented by black, smooth figures that show no distinctive physical traits. Thus, no recognition of individual characters is possible, and identification with those bodies on a representational level is rather discouraged. This might be an artistic choice, since the detainees were mainly kept in darkness, so the visual recognition of one another was impeded. The virtuality of the bodies is stressed when their construction grid is shown. By making its otherwise invisible construction network visible, attention is directed once again toward the surface. When shifting our focus to the appearance of the website, we need to consider that the browser bar is possibly other open tabs and windows are still visible when entering Sagnaya. Tabs and windows overlap either in front of each other or on top of each other, depending on one's perspective, really. Film scholar and historian Anne Friedberg connects this overlapping of windows or tabs on the screen with multitasking and what Erwin Panofsky coined as the dynamization of space. You can be at two or more places at the same time, in two or more time frames, in two or more modes of identity. As a spectator/user, I am aware of the various other virtual spaces potentially available to me. While the three-dimensional perspective of the Sagnaya model allows the illusion of immersion, the materiality of the overlapping tabs laid upon each other or stacked makes the spectator aware of their surfaces and the surface of the screen itself, once again allowing a haptic view. Moving on to the last section of this presentation, let us consider the documentary ability of animation. The media scholars Landsmann and Bender argue for the capacity of animated documentary to foster a novel relationship between viewer and film that moves away from faith in the authority of indexical images and moves toward trust in the documentary to make a truth claim that reflects the world in a complex and sophisticated way. Indexical signs are physically or causally connected to the thing they represent. The classic example is the analog film image, which is created by light falling upon the thing it represents, which then reflects through the lens onto the film on which the image of the thing is ingrained through photographic emulsions. In computer-generated images and animations, this relationship with reality is disturbed. Landsmann and Bender argue that not despite, but precisely because of the lack of indexicality and the unique implementation of innovative animation techniques, animated documentary may produce trustworthy representations of reality. The authors mobilize a phenomenological account of cinema that aims to explain how meaning is experienced as a series of somatic effects produced by the film. From this perspective, a film is inseparable from the way it is experienced by an active, situated, and embodied spectator. Applied to Sagnaya, the lack of immediate indexicality of the animated images offers the viewer potentially radical embodied experience, while at the same time, the animated nature of the images, especially the bodies, offers a shielding distance that allows for reflection. The lack of commitment to mimetic realism, once again considering the black bodies, expands the embodied cognition and identification and is not devaluing it. I argue these embodied experiences are even facilitated by the spectator's navigation through the prism, which causes a higher engagement of the spectator's body. By its investment of into the viewer's experience, into the re-articulation of historical narrative, Sagnaya becomes a politically creative process and has the potential to make a meaningful and important contribution to the continuous shaping of the collective memory of the Syrian war. Expanding the potentials illustrated by Landsmann and Bender, in Sagnaya, the animation techniques perform an investigative function based on the principles of forensic aesthetics that center around the conjunction of the testimonies and the translation of such integrated testimonial account through media technologies. Connected to the ideas of realism, not only, but also in animated documentary, is the indexicality of images and the lack thereof, as I've discussed before. Tom Gunning criticizes the focus on indexicality in cinema studies generally, and favors a phenomenological approach that goes back to maths and suggests movement as an alternative concept. In order to create mental impressions of reality, cinematic images do not require an upholding of an indexical relationship to reality, despite their potential to do so, of course. Such impressions of reality can be achieved by considering the kinesthetic embodied experience of images by the spectator. In other words, the embodied experience of a spectator watching a person running in reality and watching a person running on screen are the same and actually decisive in assessing the realness of the images. Hence, the possibilities to create persuasion are thus not entirely dependent on the indexical value of the images, but also shaped by their appearance and perception. Referring to the previous discussion, we trust the film rather than it is ontologically true. In Sadnaya, the malleability of animated images and testimony, which is inevitably based on memories, is present. Mental impressions of reality are not created by an upheld relationship with indexicality, but through the kinesthetic embodied experiences of the images of the spectators. The exposition of the modeling process and reflections on the discordant testimonies make the filmmaking process transparent and add to the believability and trustworthiness of the arguments. Closing, I would like to state that animated documentaries require more attention, especially in relation to collective memory, as they do not only add stories to the discourse that would remain otherwise invisible, but they do allow for new forms of collective memory and foreground haptic and embodied experiences by the spectators. Furthermore, Sadnaya, inside a Syrian torture prison, extends the strategies of animated documentary that have been in focus so far, such as representing mental states and subjective experiences in abstract poetic ways. By using animation to not only heighten embodied spectatorship, but deploying it as a tool of investigation and externalization of testimonial memory, methods of forensic aesthetics establish novel ways of engaging with memory, images, space, and truth claims. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Melina, not only for your great presentation, but also for adapting to the 15 minutes time. So we have more time for the discussion. And we right now, it's time to pass to the second presentation in this panel. Cahal McLaughlin is Chair of Film Studies at Queen's University Belfast, and also Director of the Prison's Memory Archive and the Center for Documentary Research. And he's going to present a paper entitled The Prison Memory Archive, a Conflicted Past in a Contested Present. So, Cahal, when you want it, you can begin.
Okay, thank you very much, Ivan. And it's great to follow on from Melina's project, because this is also about prisons and memory. Just very briefly to start with, I'm going to show you a clip about 1.5 minutes, and at that point I'll share the link because we believe the quality will be better if you watch it. What was known as the Troubles in the north of Ireland lasted for 30 years, and we are currently in the process of a precarious, halting peace process. The primary military violence has ended, but there is kind of low-key instability continuing. There's still a lot of issues to be resolved. One of which is, in fact, the government's own ability to be able to address the legacy of the past. There is no agreed methodology on how to think about and officially engage with the legacy of the past. If we think of Argentina and Brazil and Chile, if we think of South Africa, there have been processes. One could make arguments about the success and the limitations of such truth recovery or truth and reconciliation commissions, but at least the governments have initiated something. Nothing has happened with the British government, and this has created a vacuum. There have been attempts, 3 official attempts or reports to do this, but none of them have been taken up by the government as yet. This vacuum has been filled by bottom-up community or sometimes academic initiatives. And the Prisons Memory Archive is one of those. Is how do we address a conflicted past in a contested continuing present? The prisons themselves were closed in the year 2000 after the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. And it took us several years to get access to those empty prisons and several years to agree with the constituent groups. And it was very important for us to have a set of protocols that was inclusive. If we think of how the cinematic representation of the conflict here, particularly the prisons, there is a tendency to prioritize the narrative of the Republican military struggle, the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. And so for us, while that is absolutely central, there are also equally important narratives to address. Those are prison officers, loyalist prisoners, but also teachers, maintenance workers, lawyers, probation officers, all of those who passed through the gates of the prison. So inclusivity to us was absolutely essential, and it took us some time to persuade different groups to contribute to a shared virtual space. Probably the most important protocol was co-ownership. And this means that those people who contributed co-own their own separate material. And the risk is that people have the right to withdraw right up to and even after the material goes public. And indeed that's happened. There are 2 constituencies, loyalist prisoners, and about 6 of those withdrew over the years for different reasons. One was the ongoing political instability, and the loyalist working class continued to feel vulnerable that the state that they've identified with is continually at political risk, let's say, and I can go into that in detail if anybody wants to know more, but we've had 6 withdrawals. And we've had 2 prison officer withdrawals after a prison officer was killed several years ago by the new IRA, one of the dissident groups. And although those prison officers were retired, there was a kind of a feeling of insecurity on their part, and they wanted to feel safe, so they withdrew. But the reward is that the other loyalists and the other prison officers and everybody else stays on board because it builds up trust. And that's very, very important when there are political and psychic sensitivities going on here. The third protocol was life storytelling. I used to work for Channel 4 television, and when you went out looking for stories, in some ways you knew what you were looking for. There's a political economy that means you've got to go after the particular story that you want, small p political economy. You have to go to the story that you want to bring it back for the commissioning editor, for the editor, for the producer, etc. We wanted to open up. We wanted the agenda to be shared. If people are going to be co-owners of their own story, then they needed to share in the agency of what was being told, how it was being told. And so we followed life storytelling, an oral history practice where you don't ask leading questions. And this means sometimes people didn't talk about things that we thought they would. One person who was in a hunger strike didn't talk about it at all. And on the other hand, people talked about things that you could never have anticipated, which was a revelation. So the issue was, how do we get this going? And we already had in mind a digital archive. We'd done some experimentation, we'd made a little film, but we decided that with digital developments in 2006 and 7, if we recorded as much as possible and made as much as possible available through a digital archive, this would be the best direction to follow for this quite complex story or stories of the prison system during the conflict. So we allowed people to walk and talk their way around the site. Some people took 30 minutes, some people took 4 hours. In one case, we had to ask 2 female Republican ex-prisoners to leave the site because we were told to be out at 6 o'clock by the council that owned the site. And the 2 female ex-prisoner said this is the first time they were ever kicked out of a prison. The important thing, as I said, about kind of life storytelling is we tried not to ask any leading questions. We had camera operators and we tried to make it a conversation. So it was a camera operator and one or two individuals and radio mics so that there wasn't a crew. It became much more, I suppose, relaxed and allowed the participants to be a little bit more confident in their relationship. And with a radio mic, they could turn their back, and I'll show you in the clip how that works as well. And they could talk about anything that they wanted. And later on, they could remove anything if they wanted to. And we set it up. We took 15 minutes before we went out onto the site, and then about 15 minutes when they come back, just to check that everything, they felt comfortable with the technology, with the process, the methodology, etc. In 2006, we went into the women's prison, Armagh Jail, and we filmed about 40 participants. We were given 2 weeks, very short notice. And it was a smaller prison than the Maison Lancache, the men's prison, which at the time during the conflict was the largest prison in Europe. And the following year, we recorded about 130 people there. So I'm just going to show you a little clip, about 1.5 minutes, but let's say we'll take 2 minutes. Let me see now, I'll just, there it is there. I think you've all got that. So the time now is 10, let's say 10:30. So I'll start talking again about 10:32. Okay, 10:33 to be safe. I'm very sorry, I should have introduced this clip. If you just don't mind listening to me, just pause on it. I should have said a little bit about it. This is John Hetherington. John Hetherington is a prison officer. John goes back to the hospital wing. And the reason I've chosen this clip is because as John steps into the hospital wing, he remembers that 10 IRA hunger strikers died there during a protest in 1981 in their attempt to get political status. And for a prison officer to express any empathy for the prisoners' families was exceptional. And John has got a history, I think, of being in the service before the conflict. He never felt very comfortable during the conflict dealing with political prisoners, particularly internees, people who were imprisoned without charges and court cases. And that kind of, that ambivalence that he expresses about his past also comes out in this moment as he comes in and he starts to remember the deaths of the hunger strikers. And he actually talks about the process and the difficulty of putting effort into that memory work. And I thought that would be interesting and relevant. So sorry, I'll come back in 3 minutes. Thank you. Okay, I think everyone's watched that. Thank you. So we gathered together, as I say, a huge range of these walk and talk. We're reluctant to call them interviews because we're recording people's memories as they were stimulated by the materiality of the site, and that was very important. For two reasons. One, as a filmmaker, it's very interesting how people's memory operate back at the site of the experience, both in terms of what they remember. Often people would say, it's amazing what you remember when you come back here, but also the visual chronology that happens. People don't remember sequentially. They remember if they go into a particular room, they suddenly remember something. And for us, there was a kind of a visual richness to the way that that memory works. So we decided that we would try and we initially thought about an interactive documentary where people could create their own little documentaries, as it were, and work their way through the site. But the expense of that was so kind of beyond our means, and we couldn't find a particular funder that would address that issue. So we have a much more standard digital archive, which is currently being set up by the Public Record Office, which is a government department in the north of Ireland. So they're going through that whole process. Some of it's available already. All of it, there's about 300 hours of material. All of it will be available on site, and some of it will be available online as they develop their own technology. We are the Public Records' first audiovisual archive. All their other archives have been primarily text-based. So they're learning, it's a learning curve for them as well. The second iteration is a website. And so that clip that you just watched is from the Prison's Memory Archive website. It's the second version of the website. We learned a lot with the first one, and that we tried to make it interactive, but in fact, most people who use the site tend to be for educational purposes, either in the community or in schools or for research. So we've redesigned it completely, making it much more geared towards educational purposes. And we've also, over the years, because it took us a long time to raise funding, we edited 2 films from the material. And these are available, interesting. I know some of you are from Portugal and Argentina and elsewhere, but we have Spanish and Portuguese versions of those films, and you should be able to find them on the website. But do email if anyone wants to follow up. One is about the female prison, Armadillo, and one of them is about the experience of women in the men's prison as visitors, teachers, probation officers, etc. So just to kind of start moving towards the end, reception. How is this material being received by the community? And it has been shown internationally, but probably more importantly, our primary audience is our local communities, because as I said, we still live in a very conflicted time or contested time. Working class communities are still divided into Protestant or Catholic. I'm using those as shorthand. More peace walls, they're called peace walls, were built after the end of the conflict than actually during the conflict. And that gives an indication of the continuing contestation and tension that's around. So we've shown this film in different communities. And I want to give 2 quick examples. One was in a mixed women's group in West Belfast. We showed the one about Armagh Jail, the women's prison. And what was really interesting was that that women's group didn't talk about anything in the film in the discussion afterwards. They talked about their own experiences. What the film did by having prison officers, prisoners, etc., it created a shared space. And so the women in that group then used the safety of that shared space that they had kind of been exposed to virtually to then share with each other stories of their daughter, their son, their husband, whoever, their father, who had been injured, killed, or imprisoned during the conflict. And the community worker who organized the event actually wanted that to happen. It was one of her motivations. And so it was very successful in creating shared space. Another one at the other end of the spectrum of reception was we showed it to people who used to work in the services. I mean, the British Army, the prison service, the police service, and the response was visceral anger. It was a very difficult, very painful experience. And we have to remember that anger is the other side of pain. And many of those people in transitional societies feel as if the government, by talking to the terrorists, have compromised the sacrifices that they made. And they felt that here we were showing terrorists on screen. And in fact, there were terrorists in government, whereas they had sacrificed their comrades and their own situation, risked their own lives in order to kind of put people in prison. And here we were celebrating them. So we always have to be very, very careful when we show this material, and the people who are running the events know exactly what they're going to see. Okay, I think I'm probably out of my 15 minutes, but that was open to questions afterwards. And please do visit the site. There's a lot there. And if anyone wants any of the films, we can certainly send them to you. Okay, thanks, Ivan.
Thank you very much, Cahal McLaughlin, for your presentation and for sharing this material with us. Right now it's time for the third presenter, José Bértolo. He's, well, I'm going to change to Portuguese. Ele é investigador do Centro de Estudos Comparatistas da Universidade de Lisboa e vai apresentar uma comunicação sobre outro lugar de memória diferente das prisões, neste caso as casas, neste caso a casa familiar de Manoel de Oliveira. O título da comunicação é Reviver o Passado na Casa de Manoel de Oliveira. Então, José, quando quiseres, podes começar.
Obrigado, Ivan. First of all, I would like to apologize to my fellow panelists for speaking in Portuguese. But since I submitted my proposal in Portuguese, I didn't have the time to switch to English. I already had prepared this in Portuguese. I hope this is not too much of an alienating experience for you. And now I'm going to switch to Portuguese. I'm sorry. Quero também saudar todos os presentes, evidentemente, agradecer à organização por terem aceitado a minha proposta. É um prazer estar aqui, já estive ontem, volto a estar hoje com muito prazer. E queria também só deixar uma ressalva: aquilo que eu vou apresentar hoje não é nada de muito novo no meu percurso. Na verdade, eu vou retomar trabalho anterior que tinha desenvolvido inicialmente no meu doutoramento e que acabou por ser publicado num livro que saiu no final do ano passado, a partir da minha tese de doutoramento. A minha ideia é um pouco retomar aquele capítulo sobre o Visita, Memórias e Confissões e tentar levar a minha reflexão sobre este filme a novas paragens. Ainda estou nesse processo, portanto ainda não cheguei lá, mas justamente pareceu-me que uma conferência sobre a memória seria o lugar ideal para começar esta revisita ao Visita. E agora vou tentar compartilhar a tela, Ivan, se...
Acho que estás autorizado, toda a gente está autorizada. Everyone can share their screen.
Ok, um momento. Peço desculpa. Ok, não, é este aqui. Compartilhar. Estão a ver? Sim? Sim? Ok. Visita ou Memórias e Confissões foi apresentado a público em 2015, cerca de um mês depois do falecimento de Oliveira. Contudo, o filme foi rodado mais de 30 anos antes, em 1981, tendo permanecido guardado por vontade do realizador, que deixou instruções para que a obra fosse projetada publicamente apenas depois da sua morte. Porém, a existência de Visita ou Memórias e Confissões era do conhecimento geral muito antes da morte do cineasta. A célebre conversa entre Antoine de Bec, Jacques Parcy e Manoel de Oliveira, publicada em 1996 pelos Cahiers du Cinéma, começa com a seguinte pergunta. Em 1981, rodou Memórias e Confissões, um filme sobre a sua própria casa, um filme que permanece deliberadamente inédito. Gostaria de começar esta conversa com a partilha desse segredo. Por que fazer esse filme? Que conta ele? Por que permanece invisível? Eu peço que aguardem a ideia de segredo e de filme invisível, porque regressarei a estas ideias mais tarde. Oliveira furta-se à resposta, mas a questão regressa algumas páginas depois, sendo que então, finalmente, o realizador conta que na origem do desejo de concretizar Visita, filme sobre a sua própria casa, como o próprio diz, esteve o facto de se ter visto obrigado a vender a sua casa no seguimento de dificuldades económicas após ter vivido nela com a sua família durante várias décadas. A pergunta de Bec e Parcy denota o estatuto que Visita ou Memórias e Confissões possuía à data da conversa, que, tendo sido completado, permanecia, no entanto, invisível. O filme de 1981 anunciava-se em 96, a data da entrevista, como uma espécie de filme fantasma, na medida em que concretizava o paradoxo de simultaneamente existir, enquanto ideia, mas também como matéria e película, ou seja, era um filme que existia materialmente, e não existir, porque era um filme que não era passível de ser projetado ou visto, ou seja, estava guardado num cofre. O caráter invisível identificado pelos entrevistadores franceses pode ser então considerado como um primeiro nível em que visita ou memórias e confissões se inscreve no domínio da espectralidade, o que se torna particularmente significativo se tomarmos em linha de conta que esta invisibilidade tem origem no desejo de projeção depois da morte, ou seja, Oliveira projetou este filme como algo que só poderia ser visto depois da data da sua morte. O filme é sobre uma casa em processo de perda, a qual, após décadas de habitação, se vê na iminência de voltar a ser desabitada, desfuncionalizada e despersonalizada. Realizando um filme sobre uma casa no momento em que está a deixar de habitá-la, Oliveira posiciona-se perante o seu objeto no limiar temporal que liga posse e perda, habitação e afastamento, experiência e memória e presença e ausência. Na primeira ocasião em que surge em campo, Oliveira conta que a casa foi projetada pelo arquiteto José Porto e que passou a habitá-la depois do seu casamento com Maria Isabel em 1942. O cineasta afirma que, cito, a casa tem um certo mistério, apontando para uma espécie de segredo que esta, no seu aspecto labiríntico, expressão dele, contém. Na constituição da casa, os objetos ocupam um lugar particular. A casa não é apenas uma construção arquitetónica, uma carcaça, mas é essencialmente um corpo, cujos órgãos são os objetos no seu interior. Discutindo a presença de livros no cinema de Oliveira, António Preto refere a exploração de uma linguagem dos objetos que resultaria, em termos cinematográficos, num teatro dos objetos. E as expressões linguagem dos objetos e teatro dos objetos são de António Preto. Na verdade, são os objetos aquilo que parece adquirir uma importância privilegiada na economia da representação da casa, dado que eles funcionam eficazmente como sinais da presença da família Oliveira naquele espaço durante os cerca de 40 anos precedentes. Os objetos transportam traços de memória e neles estão inscritos o tempo e a experiência. Eles podem também ser vistos como símbolos dos indivíduos que com eles habitaram. Os objetos são, assim, instrumentos que cristalizam uma memória particular, a memória da experiência da casa, a qual é indistinguível de outros tipos de experiência, nomeadamente da vida, da família, do cinema. A noção de que os objetos são sinais de memória e experiência adquire uma importância singular no contexto específico de perda iminente em que o filme é realizado. Ou seja, lembrem-se, é o momento em que Oliveira já vendeu a sua casa, portanto vai deixar de habitá-la, e então nesse momento está a fazer um filme sobre essa casa que vai perder. Portanto, é um momento de perda, um momento de transição. Deste modo, os objetos que povoam a casa de Oliveira são simultaneamente coisas com uma materialidade concreta, mas também símbolos do passado, de um tempo e de uma ordem em processo de desaparição. Esta dinâmica é encenada particularmente com recurso a objetos que têm uma função não exclusivamente decorativa e, portanto, uma componente de uso. No primeiro plano do interior da casa, vê-se significativamente uma chaise longue e nos seguintes prossegue-se com a apresentação de uma mesa em torno da qual estão dispostas várias cadeiras e logo depois um sofá. A mesma estratégia de enfatização dos objetos utilizáveis atinge um ápice quando entramos num quarto onde se pode ver uma cama com uma particularidade notável. Não obstante a cama estar feita, é visível que o colchão está abaulado. Este abaulamento não pode senão evocar a presença ausente daqueles que tantas vezes se deitaram nele, acabando por deformá-lo pelo uso. Neste caso, Manoel de Oliveira e a sua mulher Maria Isabel. Em Over, uma voz comenta ironicamente, cito, "Este é o quarto. Foi construído para que nele aparecessem as coisas presentes." O plano da cama, que estão a ver, traz à memória o momento em que Lila entra no quarto de Mrs. Bates, numa outra casa paradigmática da história do cinema, a de Psycho, de Alfred Hitchcock, 1960. Laura Mulvey caracterizou exemplarmente a cama da mãe morta-viva de Hitchcock nos seguintes termos que se afiguram igualmente adequados ao filme de Oliveira. Cito, "O quarto de Mrs. Bates é evidentemente mantido como se ela estivesse viva. A pia, a lareira e as roupas, todas prontas a usar. Mas o único sinal da presença humana é a estranha impressão de um corpo, como um fóssil deixada na cama. Se antes me referi aos objetos como sinais da presença, reformulo agora, dizendo que a cama funciona como um perfeito índice, em termos semióticos, dessa presença ausente. Recordemos que na tríade desenvolvida por Charles Peirce, o índice é aquele que mantém uma relação física direta com o que vem de trás. É por isso uma noção que põe diretamente em evidência uma certa confusão de temporalidades, tal como Mulvey bem expõe. Volto a citá-la. Mas alguma coisa deve deixar ou ter deixado uma marca ou um traço da sua presença. Ora persista, como no outrora, then-ness, de uma impressão digital, ora não persista, como no agora, now-ness, da sombra num relógio de sol, a coisa inscreve o seu signo num momento temporal específico. Assim, o índice mantém uma relação privilegiada com o tempo, o momento e a duração da inscrição, e também tem uma relação física com o original do qual é um signo. E, no âmbito desta conferência, dir-se-ia também, acrescentando ao que Mulvey diz, que o índice tem sempre uma ligação privilegiada com a memória, necessariamente. De todos os objetos que se vêem em visita e que inevitavelmente transportam em si a marca de um passado em perda, a cama é aquele que, no abaulamento do colchão que vimos, concretiza mais eloquentemente essa ideia. A ideia do índice como uma marca física da memória. Se os objetos e a casa são os perfeitos sinais do tempo e da memória, é Oliveira quem, na sua materialidade física, natural, no sentido em que ele é um ser humano natural, sobressai enquanto o espectro definitivo do filme. Deste mesmo estatuto dá conta José Manoel Costa ao comentar a primeira aparição do cineasta no seu próprio filme. Desculpem, não está a avançar. Ok. O que poderia ter surgido como o plano mais realista, surge-nos assim como mais fantasmático, diz-nos José Manuel Costa. Como o próprio não deixará de referir em seguida, mencionando o facto de o seu espírito a ter longamente habitado, ele filma-se literalmente como o espírito da casa, ou seja, aquele que, qual fantasma apaixonado de Mankiewicz, e como José Manuel Costa está a referir-se ao Captain Gregg de The Ghost and Mrs. Muir, de Joseph L. Mankiewicz, um filme dos anos 40, só é visto por quem quer. Tal como Oliveira afirma na abertura, trata-se de um filme sobre si mesmo, mas é sobre si mesmo na medida em que é, sobretudo, sobre as coisas que constituíram a sua vida. A família, a mulher, o negócio do pai, a experiência da ditadura, as casas que habitou, o cinema que fez e, importante agora, que o fez. Visitou Memórias e Confissões, entronca assim num grupo de filmes de Oliveira sobre si próprio, todos eles posteriores, não obstante serem mostrados ao público antes de Visita, designadamente Viagem ao Princípio do Mundo, em 1997, e Porto da Minha Infância, de 2001. Todos estes filmes, Visita incluído, sendo autobiográficos, são fortemente autorreflexivos e, portanto, eles tematizam simultaneamente a vida de Oliveira e o próprio cinema, como se estes fossem indesvinculáveis, de certa forma. E, portanto, sempre que Oliveira fala sobre si mesmo, fala também sobre cinema. Um pouco como nós, quando falamos da academia, falamos sobre nós mesmos, porque é isso que governa a nossa vida, não é? E a dirige. Portanto, da casa à vida, ao cinema, à casa, vida, cinema. Os três são aproximados em diversos momentos importantes do filme. Nos créditos iniciais, Oliveira refere, relembro, que este é um filme sobre Manoel de Oliveira, a propósito de uma casa. Quando o cineasta entra em cena pela primeira vez, alguns minutos depois, começa por afirmar, e vou citá-lo: "O cinema é a minha grande paixão. E sempre tudo sacrifiquei à possibilidade de fazer filmes." Fim de citação, com prosódia do Manoel Oliveira, uma coisa que nunca tinha feito, mas enfim. Ainda nesta primeira sequência, o realizador projeta filmes antigos da sua família, os quais obtêm uma significação renovada no novo contexto, o de Visita, o filme em que eles são reenquadrados, já não apenas home movies, mas sim cinema, porque Visita ou Memórias e Confissões é cinema. No segmento em que a esposa Maria Isabel surge em campo, ela reforça, cito-a: "Os últimos anos têm sido de luta, porque fiquei sobrecarregada com todos os problemas materiais e familiares para que o Manoel ficasse, notem, entregue completamente ao cinema." E, confrontada com a pergunta: "O que é a sua vida em família com um homem como Manoel de Oliveira?", ela responde, e volto a citá-la: "De abnegação e compreensão." E agora reparem, porque não se pode separar o artista do homem, sem que a pessoa fique completamente anulada na sua personalidade. O segmento do filme dedicado à fábrica da família Oliveira termina com um ingresso no estúdio da Tobis, o qual, por sua vez, inicia com o plano de uma grande tela na qual está projetada a sombra do realizador, tornada sombra de uma sombra, se considerarmos que o cinema é um reino de sombras, como Gorky defendia. Se o cinema é um reino de sombras, quando vemos Oliveira, como vimos antes, em campo, vemos uma sombra, e quando vemos a sombra de Oliveira projetada, como nesta imagem que estou a mostrar, vemos a sombra de uma sombra. Ainda nesta sequência, Oliveira afirma: "Mas eu não sou, nunca fui, um homem da indústria." Isto porque a família dele era uma família ligada à indústria, portanto tinha uma fábrica. "Sou sim, sempre fui, perdão, mas também é interessante, sempre foi, um homem de cinema." Tudo caminha, afinal, neste filme, a propósito de uma casa, para a convergência entre a vida e o cinema. Uma vida dedicada ao cinema. E o filme em ato que aqui se constrói é um ato de amor igualmente pelas casas, pela família, pela mulher, pelo cinema. Numa das suas aparições, Oliveira comenta justamente, cito: "Só o amor pode dar sentido à vida na sua plenitude." Aqui chegados, talvez possamos compreender o segredo a que aludiam os entrevistadores franceses, ou porque é que Visita ou Memórias e Confissões ficou inacessível até depois da morte de Oliveira. Não parece tratar-se apenas de pudor ou decoro da parte do cineasta. Aquilo que parece estar em jogo é a decisão deliberada e consciente de um homem que, vivendo pelo e para o cinema, escolhe tornar um filme com o conjunto de características que aqui caracterizei, e há muitas outras que ficaram de fora, não é? Há muitas características neste filme importantes que eu não pude focar aqui. Portanto, um homem dizia que, vivendo pelo e para o cinema, escolhe tornar um filme com estas características a sua obra póstuma. Importantíssima noção. Ao mesmo tempo que Oliveira realiza o retrato da casa no momento da sua passagem de proprietários, elabora também o seu autorretrato no momento análogo e prospectivo de passagem, da vida à morte. Enquanto filme testamento, Visita ou Memórias e Confissões concretiza o regresso de Oliveira para entre os vivos, possibilitando-lhe uma vida póstuma no cinema, cristalizada na mesma película em que habitam os espectros dos membros da sua família, a película deste filme. Para além do traço material do espírito de Oliveira, como escreveram Baek e Parsi, eles falaram do traço material do espírito de Oliveira, restam também neste filme os traços dos outros que se veem. A mulher, os filhos, os netos, os pais, os avós. Se virem o filme, poderão confirmar que todas estas pessoas são visíveis, se não em campo, ao menos em retratos. Há uma sequência com retratos de toda a família. A película do filme torna-se, assim, uma espécie de jazigo familiar, um túmulo de celuloide, como lhe chamou António Preto. E a sua projeção liberta os fantasmas, animando-os e atribuindo-lhes uma nova e eterna vida. E se esta é uma ideia generalizável a todo o cinema, é-o contingentemente, devido à ontologia espectral comum a todos os filmes. No entanto, aquilo que importa tomar em consideração a propósito de Visita ou Memórias e Confissões é que Oliveira concebe deliberadamente o seu filme de forma a beneficiar destas características inerentes ao meio cinematográfico para possibilitar a perpetuação da sua vida, tanto junto daqueles que lhe eram mais próximos em vida e que estão agora embalsamados. Convoco o célebre texto sobre a ontologia da imagem de Bazin, consigo na película, quanto junto daqueles outros, nós, os espectadores, que continuam a tornar-lhe possível viver pelo cinema em visita a Memórias e Confissões. Somos nós que permitimos a Oliveira ser literalmente um homem feito de cinema. Ele caracteriza-se como um homem de cinema. Portanto, faço aqui uma brincadeira, homem feito, parentes de cinema. Depois da sua morte, quando, ao vermos e revermos o filme, libertamos a sua imagem, que agora passa a substituir realmente o ser original, morto e de outro modo irremediavelmente perdido. Trata-se esta de uma conceptualização do cinema, não apenas como guardador de memórias, mas como produtor de fantasmas. Agradeço o vosso tempo e a vossa atenção. Lamento muito que esta apresentação não possa adiantar muito o trabalho que eu já tinha desenvolvido antes a propósito deste filme. Na verdade, repito aqui muitas ideias, mas, enfim, queria partilhar convosco e eventualmente poderemos conversar sobre isto depois. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado, José.
Vou parar o compartilhamento.
A tua comunicação propõe a Casa, mas também o cinema como lugar de memória, e faço uma boa ponte com a comunicação que vamos ter para encerrar este painel, a comunicação da Natalia Taccetta, que, y ahora paso para el español, la comunicación de Natalia tiene a la televisión como medio, como lugar de memoria en este caso. Entonces, ella es investigadora adjunta del Consejo Nacional de Investigaciones Científicas y Técnicas de Argentina y docente e investigadora en la Universidad Nacional de las Artes y de la Universidad Nacional de 3 de Febrero. Su comunicación se titula en concreto Archivo y desconfianza, la imagen televisiva frente al problema de la reescritura de la historia. Cuando quieras, Natalia, puedes comenzar con tu intervención.
Muchas gracias, Iván. Thank you for the presence of the colleagues. Thank you to the conference for accepting me to have this presentation with you today. I leave you here the link of the trailer of the film. It's with English subtitles. Maybe it's helpful to have some idea about the film, because I'm talking my presentation in Spanish. I'm going to voy a decir algunas cosas. I'm going to say something about 1982, a film of by Lucas Gallo, about the television archive here in Argentina during the Malvinas War. That's why the title of the film. El documental 1982 de Lucas Gallo, de 2020, propone la revisión de imágenes provenientes de la televisión oficial durante la última dictadura cívico-militar en Argentina. Aún con un dispositivo muy austero, permite reflexionar sobre los usos y abusos de la propaganda durante la Guerra de Malvinas, que permitió poner en suspenso los desastres a todas luces evidentes de la dictadura en su tramo final. La Junta dictatorial de gobierno decide invadir las Islas Malvinas bajo el lema de la reconquista, propiciando un nacionalismo desquiciado, dando inicio a uno de los conflictos más ominosos que enfrentó la Argentina contemporánea, con secuelas que perviven en la sociedad en múltiples niveles. Exhibiendo parte de la imagen que se publicitó en general durante los 74 días que duró la guerra con Inglaterra, el film de Lucas Gallo desnuda operaciones de manipulación y propaganda y mecanismos de construcción de un triunfalismo mediático imposible sin complicidad cívica. Dicho esto, 1982 puede confrontarse teóricamente desde la teoría del archivo, en la medida en que se atienda a las implicancias políticas, estéticas y epistemológicas de revisar archivos oficiales en sociedades posrepresivas como la Argentina. Al mismo tiempo, posibilita reflexionar sobre la tensión entre archivo e historia para, como diría Arun Farocki, desconfiar metodológicamente de las imágenes y así evaluar la productividad de la perspectiva del archivo en sus acercamientos más contemporáneos, con autores como Jamie Baron, Andrea Giunta, Miguel Valderrama, Cristian Gómez Moya, etc. Ellos exploran en profundidad también la construcción de la imagen como una praxis política, en la herencia de muchos autores, ¿no? Farocki posiblemente sea uno de ellos. Explorar el concepto de archivo implica asumir como problema la copresencia de temporalidades heterogéneas que conforman un complejo como vía de acceso al presente en la forma de una arqueología, tal como lo diría Giorgio Agamben, y al mismo tiempo pensar el modo en que las artes audiovisuales latinoamericanas contemporáneas problematizan el uso, la accesibilidad, la constitución, la desacralización de documentos desde perspectivas múltiples, desde las más experimentales y vanguardistas hasta las más ortodoxas, pasando incluso por diversas formas de la autobiografía. En su prólogo al libro Desconfiar de las imágenes, de Arun Farocki, George Scheuermann lanza una pregunta que parece pertinente incluso para analizar la cultura contemporánea, en la que la visibilidad, la imagen y la velocidad traban tal relación que nada parece que puede ser escondido. Sin embargo, Scheuermann se pregunta cómo abrir los ojos. Allí dice, lo cito brevemente, ciertamente no existe una sola imagen que no implique simultáneamente miradas, gestos y pensamientos. Sea como sea, no existe tal cosa como una imagen que sea pura visión, absoluto pensamiento o simple manipulación. Fin de la cita. Con esta idea inaugura una profunda reflexión sobre los estratos significantes que implican las imágenes y la imposibilidad de clausurar su sentido en una única dirección. Todas las imágenes del mundo, dice Scheuermann, son el resultado de alguna manipulación. No obstante, lejos de naturalizar esto, el texto arenga un estado de desconfianza o alerta permanente. Nada, ni siquiera una imagen de archivo, y justamente mucho menos una imagen de archivo, está exento de la voluntad de quien la inserta en un relato, la localiza en una cronología, la junta con otros documentos para cambiar su sentido. Con esta apuesta a una desconfianza que podría llamarse metodológica, Lucas Gallo construye un film solo a partir de material de archivo, con poquísimos carteles y con un uso bastante moderado del montaje, al menos sin artilugios retóricos muy evidentes, como podría haber sido el montaje paralelo, o los grandes contrapuntos, o la utilización expresiva del sonido, nada de eso. Es bastante parco el dispositivo. De hecho, quisiera compartir simplemente alguna imagen para que tengan idea. Una imagen, pasan cosas en el documental como esta, donde simplemente se ve la imagen de archivo, en movimiento, por supuesto. Yo ahí puse el pic nada más como para tener una referencia, y se ve la imagen de archivo oficial, digamos. No hay mayor intervención, salvo en algunos momentos donde hay algunos reencuadres o se superponen distintas imágenes, como podría ser este caso. Con esta apuesta a una desconfianza, entonces decíamos, Lucas Gallo construye un film solo a partir del material de archivo, con poquísimos carteles, con un uso moderado del montaje. De modo muy general, el film apuesta a un desvelamiento, pero no como si hubiera un gran secreto, pues es sabida la censura que reinaba en épocas de dictadura y cómo los materiales que llegaban de las Islas Malvinas, ya fueran para la televisión oficial o de las agencias de noticias, siempre eran interceptados y manipulados, sino para volver a mirar el secreto a voces y construir un dispositivo que recuerde los mecanismos siniestros que se ponían en funcionamiento desde la radio, la televisión y los medios gráficos. En este sentido, podría decirse que Gallo tergiversa la lógica de la ficción creada por la última junta militar de la dictadura para seguir elaborando la historia y para actualizar el planteo en el escenario neoliberal actual entre fake news y el lawfare. En los términos de Wolfgang Ernst, podría decirse que el dispositivo de Gallo arroja un uso no metafórico del archivo, en tanto construye efectivamente un aparato de almacenamiento y clasificación, una práctica, como diría Ernst, de memorización con capacidad administrativa. Si bien el autor está pensando más específicamente en el desafío digital, resulta relevante recordar que su idea de almacenamiento cultural se vincula con un énfasis en la transferencia. De este modo, podría recordarse que el film 1982 no trabaja materiales que no estén online, que no sean de fácil acceso a YouTube, aunque estén en baja calidad, pero le da una organización eminentemente cronológica a partir de la cual problematizar la propia arqueología de los medios. El carácter discontinuo del archivo en general adquiere en el caso de 1982 un nivel operativo del presente en el que nada ni nadie nos habla estrictamente. Más bien se trata de un dispositivo de almacenamiento de una arquitectura espacial y temporal. porque en un texto llamado El archivo como metáfora del espacio de archivo al tiempo de archivo, Ernst caracteriza el archivo a partir de esos espacios intermedios, de esos que él llama agujeros, que son los que escanden los silencios y la articulación entre lo sintáctico y lo semántico, del mismo modo que se construye la coherencia y la cohesión de los dispositivos ficcionales. Dice Ernst: quien lee coherencia en papeles de archivo realiza ficción y les da sentido a letras muertas en el modo de la prosopopeya retórica. Según esta perspectiva, el pasado se presenta en datos que no se transforman en un relato hasta que no son concebidos en un archivo. Por eso esto nada tiene que ver con la memoria colectiva, que no es una práctica de almacenamiento ni lidia con los reveses de la diacronía y la sincronía, por lo menos en la perspectiva de Ernst. El film de Gallo, 1982, sigue una organización mayormente cronológica, desde el clima triunfalista, como ven allí, a principios de abril del 1982, en una plaza de Mayo enardecida que victorea el presidente de la Junta Militar, Leopoldo Fortunato Galtieri, aun cuando las protestas por el desastre económico de la dictadura coparan las plazas muy poquitos días antes. Lo cierto es que el desembarco de las tropas argentinas en las Islas Malvinas el 2 de abril parece recibido con sorprendente alegría, sobre todo porque el ingreso de las tropas en las islas se da de un modo pacífico y porque faltaban todavía unos cuantos días para que llegaran las represalias británicas. A partir de ahí, Gallo realiza un seguimiento del mes de abril, el desembarco de las tropas inglesas el 1 de mayo y la derrota de junio a partir de fuentes recurrentes. Esas fuentes son fragmentos de programas como este, que se llama 60 Minutes, 60 minutos, un programa de noticias típico de la época, con un histórico conductor que dramatizaba mucho las noticias y era muy simpatizante de la dictadura. Entrevistas como en este caso ven allí a los kelpers, es decir, a los lugareños de las islas, y también a soldados argentinos que están ahí y que todavía en el mes de abril tienen un clima de paz porque no han llegado, decíamos, las tropas inglesas a tomar represalias. También, por supuesto, imágenes de Galtieri, de Alexander Haig, del Tango 01, del avión presidencial que lleva supuestamente el sueño de varias generaciones de argentinos que quieren teóricamente reconquistar las islas, muy polémica esa idea. Y fragmentos también de algunos programas de televisión que se hacían en la época para juntar fondos para los soldados. Me detengo ahí, ahora ya les digo por qué. A ese material se suma naturalmente lo que podrían denominarse las imágenes documentales del frente o de campaña. Al pensar en este material resuenan las reflexiones de Siegfried Krakauer, quien de Caligari a Hitler, aquel viejo libro de 1947, analizaba la propaganda totalitaria del nazismo que, aunque parecía estar lejos de la política, como decía Krakauer, constituía un refuerzo de toda adhesión al régimen dictatorial. Allí Krakauer caracterizaba este tipo de materiales a partir del análisis de sus rasgos visuales y del modo en que pretendían operar. Debían ser fieles a la realidad y por tanto exhibir el campo de batalla y generar la sensación de ser un testigo de los hechos, elaborar sentido a partir de la repetición, trabajar con cierta velocidad, es decir, estar en continuo movimiento, siempre tenía que estar pasando algo, intercalar comentarios que ataquen las virtudes marciales como el valor, la habilidad, la perseverancia, y un uso del montaje que permite ilustrar con claridad estas ideas, articular a través del mito triunfalista como un destino, una misión histórica, una época construida a partir de tomas panorámicas, narraciones elípticas y finales felices. Este es un buen ejemplo de eso porque mientras están las represalias británicas están haciendo estragos obviamente en Puerto Argentino y están destruyendo la artillería argentina, el programa 60 minutos y los documentales que llegaban de campaña eran tan nacionalistas y tan manipuladores que destacan que entre toda esa destrucción igual flamea la bandera argentina, lo cual es absolutamente absurdo. La bandera solo flameaba de casualidad, pero todo lo demás que se ve alrededor es absoluta destrucción. A pesar de tratarse de un libro publicado en 1947 y de referirse al nazismo, resulta sorprendente el modo en que en 1982 la película de Gallo exhibe algunas de las características, o juega, o tergiversa, o torsiona algunas de las características que mencionaba Krakauer. El material administrado por el film exhibe fundamentalmente al cronista Nicolás Casanseu, un viejo cronista argentino de la época, que si bien declaró profusamente que el material que él enviaba a las islas siempre era intervenido en Buenos Aires, intenta ocultar el desastre con un tono triunfalista y retórica nacionalista. Ejemplo palmario al referir rápidamente a las muertes en el ejército argentino que, para detenerse largamente sobre las bajas enemigas, o destacar, como en este caso que ven allí, la bandera argentina flameando, aunque solo hay destrucción alrededor. Lo cierto es que lo que en 1982 se expone como el mes de abril podía acompañar hasta cierto punto el clima de triunfo y reconquista. Los ingleses a cargo de las islas no se resisten al desembarco argentino y los soldados toman distintas posiciones sin mayores obstáculos. Las cosas cambian el 1 de mayo a las 4:42 cuando los británicos lanzan 21.000 bombas sobre Puerto Argentino. A pesar de ello, la imagen de triunfo que daba el programa colaborador de la dictadura 60 minutos se alimentaba de un discurso patriótico sostenido hasta por los argentinos en Estados Unidos que están dispuestos a hacer boicots a productos ingleses en los supermercados. Sin embargo, hay que notar, entre otras operaciones, que el programa emitido el 9 de mayo corresponde al ataque que había ocurrido 8 días antes, especulando con escenarios cambiantes y emociones aún ligadas al nacionalismo. Lejos de escandalizar a nadie, la emisión alcanza unos enormes niveles de audiencia. Todo ese programa, 60 minutos, fue las cosas más vistas, el programa más visto en Argentina en esa época. El segmento de la película de Gallo, que se llama Mayo, se construye especialmente por el programa emitido por dos conductores muy tradicionales argentinos de la época, que reunían donaciones para un fondo patriótico en el canal que estaba regido en ese momento, que tenía a su cargo el Poder Ejecutivo Nacional. Por ese programa desfilan artistas como Susana Rinaldi, una artista conocida por ser de izquierda, curiosamente, digo, para pensar en la locura del momento, ¿no? Una artista de izquierda que canta en éxtasis el himno nacional argentino en un programa que en principio tiene un mensaje muy favorable a las operaciones de la dictadura, digo, para mí pensar un poco en la locura del momento, o Diego Armando Maradona, también muy jovencito, que fue a la televisión a donar un montón de plata para ese fondo patriótico. Por allí desfilaron, les decía entonces, Diego Maradona, otros miembros de la selección argentina de fútbol, Mirta Legrand, una conductora histórica, o personajes históricamente identificados con la izquierda como esta artista. En el fragmento que se llama Junio, cuando los soldados ya den muestras de debilidad, y aunque las operaciones de las juntas no cesan con publicidades como Argentinos a vencer, una serie de publicidades que pretendían no todavía seguir alimentando ese nacionalismo rabioso, la ficción del triunfo, aún pese a 60 minutos, se vuelve difícil de sostener. Los cronistas intentan no profundizar en los ataques de los Sea Harrier de las fuerzas británicas bombardeando y el sonido de las ametralladoras antiaéreas. Por el contrario, subrayan las bajas de uno de los tantos aviones enemigos caídos que el enemigo no sabe reconocer. Se hablan de las bajas del enemigo, pero no hablan de las bajas propias. Las escenas de frente se entrelazan con Galtieri cantando el himno, la visita de Juan Pablo II, que ahí la ven. Hay algunas operaciones de montaje que se ven en el film, ¿no? El avión de Juan Pablo II del Papa con el helicóptero militar, digamos. Son poquitas las operaciones de montaje que hace el director de la película. Bueno, distintos mecanismos que utiliza el film, por ejemplo, para referirse finalmente al contexto, ¿no? Cuando ya la guerra es insostenible desde ese sostenimiento patriótico, cuando aparece Margaret Thatcher, aparece en este televisor en un escenario muy ligado, digamos, a la clase media argentina, en una televisión muy modesta, una televisión típica de clase media, en un comedor no demasiado lujoso ni mucho menos, ¿no? Como para poner en evidencia que todo el mundo miraba esos programas, que todo el mundo tenía como su único vínculo, digamos, con la guerra era precisamente este tipo de programas. La aparente imparcialidad en la exhibición del archivo, porque les decía, ¿no? Gallo lo que muestra es el archivo casi sin operaciones de montaje ni nada, sería una gran excepción, que no pretende ingenuidad, sino que asume un lugar metarreflexivo en relación con el uso que la imagen hizo de la dictadura, cede su espacio a la sucesión de carteles al final del film, en las que no solo se nos detallan algunos datos duros sobre el conflicto y sus 74 días, sino que también un detalle sobre las muertes argentinas que los medios se ocuparon de ocultar. Allí aparecen los 649 soldados argentinos muertos, los 2.500 heridos, los veteranos que se suicidaron en los años siguientes a la rendición del 14 de junio. Así, 1982 desafía ex post, irónicamente, el blindaje de la época y arroja un interrogante sobre la contemporaneidad en la que la desconfianza respecto a lo que se ve es un mal de archivo saludable. No solamente para repensar el archivo desfallecido de la dictadura, sino el modo en el que el espectro de algunas de sus operaciones podría volver en el presente también como una ruina de la verdad. La arqueología ficcional de Gallo exhibe el problema del archivo en su propia metodología, la intersección de la cuestión institucional, de la accesibilidad, de las operaciones contra el silenciamiento. Y en el medio, la imagen de archivo como desgarradura, representación de una cosa y su contraria. La imagen de archivo porta per se un exceso, y en su lógica de almacenamiento habrá una determinada posición en relación con él. En 1982, este film de Lucas Gallo se entrelazan así poder y desconfianza para pensar el archivo a partir del riesgo de la imaginación y el montaje, asumiendo la verdad como quimera, pero también la imagen como un espacio de contienda política. Al mismo tiempo, en términos formales, reflexiona sobre la desobediencia que implica en un contexto guiado por la inmediatez y el presentismo como la nuestra, mirar largos fragmentos de archivo de combate, largos minutos de un programa ómnibus de los años 80, escuchar estrofas del himno cantadas por un artista en éxtasis o escuchar las justificaciones imposibles de un dictador borracho. Ahí, la huella micropolítica de y en el archivo y la potencia de la disparidad temporal que precisamente en sus efectos epistemológicos problematiza lo emocional, hace que el archivo que funciona en 1982, como diría Benjamin en Excavar y Recordar, no sea un instrumento de la memoria, sino la comunicabilidad misma del recuerdo. Nada más, muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Natalia, por tu comunicación, por tu presentación. Abrimos ahora el turno de intervenciones. We right now can begin the discussion of this panel in different languages, in English, in Spanish, in Portuguese. Anyone can use the chat in order to leave their questions, or even just raise hand in order to ask permission to talk, to make any remark or ask any question to the participants. So before my own questions as chair of this panel, anyone want to take the floor right now in the audience? I'm not sure if Cahal is asking for talking right now in order to make any remarks on the presentation.
I wanted to ask Melina about the notion of the panopticon, because when you look at that prison, there is that center where everything can be seen. And I'm just wondering, I haven't seen that wonderful interactive documentary. How does it address that idea of being able to see everything? How does it address the concept of the panopticon?
Thank you for that question. I'm not discussing it in my thesis actually, because it's not so central to what is discussed in the documentary itself, but of course it's very present, this circulation. But the animated documentary really focuses on the experience of the detainees, which is also really interesting. Didn't have space to discuss it here. Is very much dependent on their auditory experiences, because it was very dark, and during the torture, the detainees were forced to close their eyes or wear blindfolds. So actually the whole idea of being seen and seeing was kind of like skewed a little bit here. And there's a lot of like, auditory memory of sounds, of just seeing a little bit of sunlight and trying to detect what kind of time of the day it is. Guessing how big a room is, or estimating how big a room is by the sound of it. So I think there's a lot of, but of course it is a very interesting question, how this panopticon relates to it. I think, since the prison guards are very absent from this project, and there's really a focus on the detainees, there's just this very physical experience. But yes.
Thank you. Yeah, I can understand that. Thanks.
Well, it's a kind of contradiction that online and interactive documentary try to show what is unseen, try to create a panopticon experience through digital technology of a kind of experience that is completely invisible, because there is no possible to film, to record within a prison, when the prison is used as such kind of enclosed place. So all these memories created after the events have already happened use technology in order to develop different kinds of representations and experience in order to transmit, to convey feelings and sensations and experiences that cannot be known otherwise without this kind of mediated technology. Even it could be the animated documentary, it could be an archive, like the prison's memory archive. Right now, well, before going on with my own reflection, I'm reading in the chat a question by our colleague Silvana Mariani for Natalia. I'm not sure if Natalia is already reading.
Yes.
The question in Portuguese, but you can answer in Spanish. I know that Silvana also speaks Spanish, so the floor is yours.
Gracias, Silvana, por la pregunta. Me parece súper interesante porque, claro, al no conocer tal vez a muchos de los personajes que desfilaron, o si alguna vez tienen una oportunidad de ver el film, hay un montón de personajes que tal vez a alguien no argentino no le dicen demasiado, pero son realmente personajes propios de la cultura popular argentina. Todo el mundo los amaba, todo el mundo los conocía, etc. Y lo cierto es que no hay izquierda, no hay mayor resistencia en Argentina en 1982. La dictadura había hecho estragos durante los primeros años, en el 76-77, y la resistencia, digamos, la intelectualidad argentina, la izquierda argentina, está básicamente en el exilio. Dicho esto, hay algunos testimonios de intelectuales súper interesantes que están en México y que apoyan incluso, curiosamente, la guerra de Malvinas. En algún caso incluso hasta podría ser con la esperanza de que termine de derrapar la dictadura incluso, ¿no? Pero estrictamente lo que uno esperaría, que haya una resistencia de parte de la izquierda en Argentina a la guerra, no había algo así en Argentina en ese momento prácticamente, porque la dictadura había destruido todo, absolutamente todo. Así que no, diría que en principio hay mucho consenso, por eso desde hace unos años en Argentina ya no se habla de dictadura militar, sino de dictadura cívico-militar. Desde hace unos años es la discusión en danza, precisamente porque no hay manera de, con los desastres económicos y políticos que hacía la dictadura, que tuvieran todavía en el poder en 1982 sin una gran ayuda, complicidad, sostén político de la sociedad civil en su conjunto. Y de hecho la primera imagen que yo les muestro, que es la Plaza de Mayo llena, 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 que es de las primeras imágenes que se ven en el documental que trabajé, es impresionante porque es un dictador que está destruyendo la economía y que el 30 de marzo le estaban haciendo un montón de marchas en contra y el 2 de abril todo el mundo está vitoreando la reconquista de las Islas Malvinas. Así que es un momento de la historia argentina absolutamente desquiciado. Sí.
Sí, solo para decir, nosotros en Brasil estábamos en un sufrimiento muy grande, así, imaginando estos soldados que pasaban frío, que no tenían ninguna condición de estar ahí luchando con una potencia mundial de esta manera, pero quizás como no teníamos esta propaganda toda para ver en la televisión, tenemos una conciencia más fuerte del absurdo que era esta guerra, ¿no?
Sí, acá no se veía tanto como absurda y además no había mucha reflexión sobre que la mayor parte de los soldados, gran parte de los soldados que fueron a Malvinas eran chicos que estaban haciendo el servicio militar en muchos casos, así que no pasaban los 18 años.
Sí, incluso
Entonces, por supuesto, había militares de carrera, pero el grueso, digamos, del ejército que toma las islas en abril son chicos muy jóvenes. Pero hay toda una operación de decir, aparecían los militares en la televisión y en los programas de televisión diciendo que no se preocuparan las madres, que los chicos iban a comer mejor que en su casa. La frase era esa, no se preocupen que van a comer mejor que en su casa. Y a las
increíble.
novias les decían que las novias no se busquen otros novios porque iban a volver, porque estaban bien cuidados. O sea, era muy fuerte la operación.
Increíble. Muchas gracias por
Gracias a vos.
I have another question for Natalia, but I saw that José, Bértolo, and Melina are also asking questions, so I can wait and give the floor. Well, Melina and José were practically at the same time. I'm not sure if who want to start. Maybe José is not talking yet in this discussion. He can go on.
It's just, well, first of all, I would like to say that I really enjoyed listening to all the interventions that I have. I'm fortunate enough to understand both English and Spanish, so I was the most fortunate in this panel. Cahal said something that I found very interesting. You said that memory is not sequential. You pointed that out. And you told that memories are activated by different things, for example, entering a room. And that idea for me is fascinating, and it has a lot to do with my own presentation, which unfortunately you have no idea about. But I was wondering if you remember the specific moments in the archival footage in the website Prisons Memory Archive, in which we can pinpoint this phenomenon. People that are moments in which memories are activated by things. For example, entering a space, a specific room, etc. Because I think that is very interesting. Of course, there's the question of the prison as a big space, which of course activates memory in this prison officer, for example. But specific things, more specific things like a room, a door, a bench, I don't know, something like that. It's a very specific question, but I was wondering if you have something to add on it.
I thank you, Jose. I think it's saturated. It's all the way through. Almost every recording has an element of that. And one example would be a female prisoner going into the cell, and she suddenly says, "My God, it's small. I don't remember it being so small." And then she looks up at the window and says, "We used to put our yogurt cartons outside to keep cool." And so those things, that's quite a good example. Another male prisoner walking down is talking about something, and he enters a room where they had political discussions, and he switches his narrative to talk about some of the discussions that they actually had. So he breaks the kind of narrative of what he's remembering. So I think it's quite threaded all the way through. Suddenly they're in a space and their narrative changes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really, and that for a filmmaker, that's really interesting because you can never anticipate what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting because in a way, in our experience of the world, the physical world, the things in the world activate memories in us. For example, I know where I bought this. It was in fact a present. I know who offered it to me, and I cannot have this cup in my hand and not think about the person who offered it to me. And that's very interesting when these kind of connections, which are not sequential, don't have to, are not related directly with narrative, chronologic time, etc., are transposed to cinema. I think that's very interesting, both in fiction film and documentary film. And I think this is in a way something that connects all our talks today in very, very different ways.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose.
We have also a question for Melina in the chat. So Melina, as you have already asked the floor, you can, well, make any comment or ask any question. And also, if you have the time, answer the question that is in the chat for you.
Yeah, we'll first jump in on the topic we're talking about right now, because in Satnaya, there's also this one situation where one of the former detainees describes a prison cell, and when he starts describing the door more details, he describes a hatch in the door, and then he starts remembering how he was forced to put his hat through it and so on. So, like, even in a virtual space, something similar is initiated, which I think is very fascinating. I have a question for Cahal. It's a very interesting project, and I was, thank you so much for presenting it today. And I was wondering how the on-site presentation of the films, maybe also relating to, okay, what does the space and the architecture, how does it relate to our memory, and what role does it play in the movie? And then how does the presentation on site work, or what do you imagine how the screenings will take place on site? And secondly, I would be interested, as you mentioned, that there was a collective space created between like people that shared experiences. If there was also a dialogue between the Loyalist and Republican, like, let's say, parties, if there was also dialogue ignited, since there were parallel narratives presented here.
And when you say the site, you mean the website?
I mean to recall that you said there are also going to be some screenings, or some kind of presentation of your project in the on the prison site, but maybe I got it wrong.
Yeah, I must have given misinformation. That site, that both sites are inaccessible. We were very lucky, and it's interesting comparing to the project you're talking about, because within several months of us filming in the male prison, 95% of that prison was demolished. In fact, you can hear in some of the recordings the huge machines tearing down the prison. We were very lucky to get in just before it was demolished. So in that sense, it's quite unique. So it's not possible to go back in. There is a little bit that's still standing for conservation reasons, but it's inaccessible. European Union gave £18 million to create a peace building centre, and they decided to keep 5 buildings, hospital, etc. The main party, the Unionist Party, the DUP, initially supported the idea and then withdrew, because they regarded no matter what you do to that site, it will always be a terrorist memorial site. It will always be the IRA narrative as the dominant narrative. And so they refused, and the 18 million went back to Europe. It was unspent. So I think that contestation around the site is quite important. So we can't go back to the site to show anything. That would have been wonderful. We had originally proposed the archive for the Peace Building Centre. It was meant to be there, and the government wanted to support that idea, but the main party pulled the plug. So that's that. I can't remember your second question. I'm sorry.
If there was also a dialogue ignited between the loyalist and Republican, because you talked about this conversation between like women whose family was affected.
Yeah, sometimes there were accidental dialogues at the time of the recording. No one wanted to speak together, but because there were 2 or 3 crews out there working, sometimes they crossed each other and they stopped and they had a conversation, but it was usually a very gentle conversation before moving on. And sometimes behind the scenes, people met and they had a conversation that was unrecorded. And since we have shown the film, sometimes we get mixed communities. As I mentioned, the women's community, but also we've had some loyalists and Republicans share the same platform. That's much more difficult. The last one we had, it was in a loyalist area, and it was 90% loyalists on the platform and in the audience, with some Republicans there, but they didn't speak up. There's still a kind of a tension and delicacy around the situation. But we have, what I didn't mention, we have an advisory group of participants, and people are welcome who took part in the project to sit on that. And we have about 10, 12 people, and that comprises prison officers, loyalists, Republicans, and they talk together in the advisory group, and they give us advice on how to proceed with the project. So at some degree, there is cooperation and sharing of stories.
Maybe now that you mentioned that it might be also a problem of like community spaces being like predominantly in loyalist areas, the online forum might also have great potential for this, right?
Yes.
That it's accessible from like without entering those like party occupied spaces somehow.
Yes, that's one of the intentions, to open up the virtual space in a way that physical space is less easy to do. That's right.
Should I just go on talking? I'm sorry, I'm taking over so much time now.
No problem, because next question is also for you. Is Miguel Mira's question about the interactive nature of your case study, comparing with other kind of formats, especially feature films. He compared this project, this case study, with another animated film, in this case, the animated film, The Swallows of Kabul, and ask you about if this project, this case study, inside a Syrian torture prison can be understood as a form of expanded cinema.
Thank you. Thank you also for the film recommendation. I do not know it, but I will definitely look it up. So I think the interactive element of Satnaya is compared to like regular film, how I should call it now, quite high. But then on the other hand, compared to games, I was also looking a little bit into that. It's rather limited. So basically, what I've shown, you have this 3D model and one can click into certain rooms and then you can walk around a little bit, but it's mostly steering the vision. And then you can click around the place, click on certain objects, and then enter into the different film clips. So the affordance is still very limited. I mean, gaming experts wouldn't call this necessarily like a gaming experience, I would say. But definitely, I'm not sure about the definition of expanded cinema precisely, but I definitely think it has a lot of potential and maybe relates a little bit more to virtual reality, in the sense that it's really focused on the vision. And I mean, you can also walk through, but I think there are much more parallels in how you like proceed through the space by clicking and dragging. And I mean, it focused a lot also on the like experience of the viewer through the mouse and the touchpad. And there's not much research done on this, really, like this haptic tactile experience of film and how we actually deal with the technology around it. So I think there's a lot of potential for future research still.
Well, we are running out of time for the discussion, but I think we can still make one or two last questions. I'm not sure if anyone in the audience want to take the floor right now. Otherwise, I have my own questions for any of the panel. Well, I have already announced a question for Natalia Taccetta on her case study. I'm going to switch to Spanish right now. Yo no conocía la película sobre la que has hablado, pero su dispositivo sí me ha recordado a otras películas que trabajan material de archivo con una distancia temporal y que deciden minimizar las intervenciones sobre ese material de archivo limitadas al montaje de los materiales, porque de esa forma, si no se añaden otras imágenes diferentes, se crea una experiencia de inmersión absoluta en la iconosfera o el espacio mediático, el discurso mediático de un tiempo concreto asociado a determinados gobiernos que controlaban el flujo de información. Estoy pensando específicamente en la película autobiografía de Nicolae Ceausescu de Andrei Gica sobre, bueno, los noticiarios rumanos en los años 60, 70. No sé si el cineasta, si el autor de 1982 también tenía esa referencia en mente o otras parecidas.
No, no que él lo diga en las entrevistas y eso, en realidad dice que comenzó, todos los materiales que se ven en la película están en YouTube, porque fundamentalmente son fragmentos de esos programas que se veían en la televisión argentina, entonces todo eso está, aunque sea en baja calidad, pero está en YouTube disponible, y que después, bueno, él cuando fue a los archivos televisivos encontró no solamente la posibilidad de ampliar la calidad, sino también encontrar algún que otro material más. Pero lo curioso es que todo eso está disponible, y lo que él dice es que simplemente lo que hizo fue una especie de relato. Por eso a mí me interesaba la perspectiva de Wolfgang Ernst, que dice, ¿no? Como todo el tiempo, bueno, los documentos no nos hablan, o sea, para que nos hablen los tenemos que poner en un dispositivo que efectivamente posibilite algún tipo de sentido, porque estrictamente no necesariamente el documento habla, bueno, tiene toda una discusión sobre eso. Así que no lo nombra a Ujica, pero para mí es evidente, no solo esa, sino tal vez incluso más la de la revolución, que no me sale el nombre, una revolución.
Videogramas de una revolución.
Videogramas, no me salía videogramas.
Videogramas.
Claro. Y ahí claramente, ¿no? Cuando se parte la pantalla en dos, hay como un trabajo, ¿no? Con lo que se vio de la tele y lo que no se vio de la tele. Lo curioso es que lo que Gallo muestra en la película 1982, todo se vio en la tele. O sea que ahora la distancia temporal hace que resulte impactante, pero todo se veía, ¿no? Como, así que no, diría que no es la referencia, para mí es la referencia obligada también, yo también lo pensé de ese modo, pero él no lo menciona concretamente, no está claro que tenga esas referencias, de hecho parece más un gesto casi espontáneo, tampoco es un cineasta de mucha trayectoria, así que también es difícil de evaluar, pero sí, me parece que la relación, yo por eso un poco llegué al libro de Farocchi para tratar de pensar algunas cosas bueno, y en algún capítulo sobre la televisión específicamente, él profundiza sobre eso, ¿no? Digamos, el problema de la manipulación y de no pensar que la manipulación es solamente una operación que se hace para irrumpir en el sentido de un texto, sino también que manipulado un poco es todo, ¿no? Lo que pasa que hay que ver cómo se solapa con algunos mecanismos. Y en ese sentido me parece que lo que hace Ujica es impresionante por eso, ¿no? Pero bueno, sí creo que tenés mucha razón, Iván, en la referencia, pero no lo menciona el director directamente.
Puede que haya un salto generacional en cuanto
Puede
a que
ser, sí.
Él
es muy joven.
Y Andrei Ujica se relaciona directamente con los archivos televisivos o cinematográficos, pero una nueva generación más habituada a trabajar en el entorno digital primero encuentra las fuentes en sus copias devaluadas disponibles en distintos repositorios digitales en Internet y luego puede acceder a la fuente original. En ese sentido,
es posible que sea eso. Sí.
También al trabajo de un cineasta canadiense que se llama Dominique Gagnon, que su obra más conocida es Of the North, que apenas trabaja con material disponible en YouTube, que él lo descarga y lo reordena. y ha sido muy criticado desde el punto de vista de los discursos que crean sus películas, porque muchas de esas imágenes pueden ser ofensivas para las personas que aparecen o los colectivos que aparecen en esas imágenes, ¿no? Pero claro, Cañón dice que esas imágenes son de Google, que él las saca, digamos, de la bestia del sistema y se las ofrece de nuevo al público para reflexionar, quizás en esa distancia temporal necesaria, sobre lo que está disponible en el archivo.
Sí, sí, sí. Creo que lo que decís de la diferencia generacional puede ser una explicación, y por lo menos en el discurso de este director empieza todo como con, bueno, más allá de, por supuesto, cómo lo afecta la guerra de Malvinas como argentino, etcétera, pero empieza medio como una curiosidad tecnológica, ¿no? Como ir a mirar documentales de Malvinas a YouTube, y él dice, bueno, a mí siempre me gustó hacer eso y después se me ocurrió hacer una película. Hay como un gesto ahí medio espontáneo que posiblemente tenga que ver con eso que vos decís, bueno, no es la imagen del archivista que se mete en el archivo y no es esa la imagen, claro. Exacto.
Muchas gracias, Natalia. Well,
No,
we
gracias.
right now are outside the time of the discussion, but even if we have to make right now a break of 30-20 minutes, but well, if anyone want to take the floor for the last time for another last intervention, question, remark, we probably have time for the last question.
Can I just a piece of information for Natalia? Your work is primarily on a film about archive in Argentina, and I think what was interesting was that Thatcher was beginning to lose popularity when the war, as she called it, in Falklands, was declared, and her popularity shot up again. But there was a lot of opposition within the UK, and there's a lot of imagery from Belfast in particular against the war in Malvinas. So there's a really interesting kind of side to that opposition within the UK, and particularly in Belfast, to the war on the Malvinas.
You say more in Belfast?
Yes, more in Belfast,
okay.
In Republican nationalist areas, but also within some working class areas, particularly the mining communities that Thatcher had devastated during the miners' strike.
Okay, thank you very much for the suggestion. Thank you. I'm going to look for it.
Okay, if you want to, I'll try and send you, and there's a particular photographer who does a lot of work. He's got a lot of archive. I'll find your email and I'll send you a link to his art. He's got an archive of photography, which includes graffiti in support of Malvinas.
Oh, thank you. Great,
okay.
Great.
Well, Cahal is right now introducing a historical question that this war, the Malvinas War, means the end of the Argentinian dictatorship, but at the same time, it could be the end of the Thatcher rule in United Kingdom, but it was the opposite, right? The opposite. It boosted the Thatcher rule. It gave Thatcher enough popular support to go on for a decade with her own government. And Thatcher's politics, especially the neoliberal politics developed by the Thatcher government in the 90s, were spread around the world, and especially in Argentina. So after the end of dictatorship, the kind of neoliberal politics leading by Margaret Thatcher arrived also in Argentina after the dictatorship, which, well, that's an historical discussion, not only about memory and about filmmaking, but, well, it's interesting. The same event and the same images of the event can be different interpretations from different sides, from different point of view. Not only national point of view, but also historical point of view.
Yes, of course. Yes.
Well, thank you very much for the 4 people who participate in this panel. Right now we have to stop in order to have a break for probably right now will be like 20 minutes break, and we will be back at 12:15 in Portugal, and, well, different hours around the world, but in 20 minutes. So thank you very much for your work, for your contributions, and we will keep in touch. And in next days, we will upload this video to YouTube in order to have a recording, a register of this discussion. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank
you very much.
Ivan. Thank you,
Bye.
everyone. Thank you,
Bye.
Ivan.